It was another warm afternoon at the Silver Line Diner. The sound of dishes, soft music, and friendly chatter filled the air. Behind the counter worked Grace Holloway, a 69-year-old widow who'd spent most of her life serving people with a smile. Her hands were a little shaky now, but her heart was still kind. At a corner booth, a group of college boys laughed too loudly. Their leader, Ryder Hail, wore an expensive watch and a grin that showed too much pride. When Grace walked over with their drinks, he leaned back and whispered something to his friends that made them snicker. Grace didn't mind. She had seen worse days. But the way Ryder looked at her made her heart sink. What Grace didn't know is that a few men sitting near the window had already noticed everything, and they were not the kind to stay silent for long. Before we move forward, tell us in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it right now? And don't forget to like and subscribe to Black and Wronged for more heart-touching stories. Let's get started. Grace moved carefully, carrying a steaming pot of coffee toward Ryder's table. She smiled politely, though her tired eyes showed years of hard work. But as she reached the table, Ryder smirked and stuck his foot out just a little. Grace stumbled. The pot slipped from her trembling hands, spilling hot coffee all over the table and onto Ryder's designer shirt. The diner went silent. Grace gasped, apologizing again and again, reaching for napkins. But before she could clean it, Ryder stood up, his voice sharp and cruel. "Watch where you're going, old lady," he shouted, and then, to everyone's shock, he spat right at her apron. The laughter of his friends filled the air like knives. Grace froze, tears welling up in her eyes. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she whispered softly, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." She didn't finish her words, because someone else had just stood up from the far corner, a tall man in a black leather jacket, his eyes fixed on Ryder. Every eye in the diner turned toward the man who had just stood up. His jacket carried the symbol of the Hells Angels, a group everyone in town knew by name but never dared to approach. The man's name was Evan, tall, calm, and built like someone who'd seen both trouble and truth. Beside him sat two other bikers, silent but alert. They had been quietly eating their lunch, but now their gaze was fixed on Ryder. Evan didn't shout. He didn't move fast. He simply took off his gloves, placed them neatly on the table, and said in a low, steady voice, "Ma'am, did he just spit on you?" Grace stood frozen, too shocked to answer. Ryder scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What's it to you, old man?" he snapped. His friends laughed again, not realizing that laughter was about to die in their throats. Evan's calm face didn't change, but his next step made the whole diner fall silent. He started walking toward Ryder's table. Evan's heavy boots echoed across the diner floor, one slow step at a time. The sound alone was enough to make the laughter fade. Ryder's smile twitched just a little, but his pride didn't let him back down. "Hey man, it was just a joke," Ryder said, forcing a grin. But Evan didn't stop. He reached the table and looked straight into Ryder's eyes. His calm voice carried more weight than any shout ever could. "Apologize," Evan said. Ryder blinked. "What?" "Apologize to her," Evan repeated, nodding toward Grace, who stood trembling near the counter. "Right now." The other bikers didn't move, but their presence filled the room like thunderclouds. Grace tried to stop him. "Please, sir, it's all right," she whispered. But Evan shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. It's not all right." Ryder laughed again to hide his fear, but when Evan leaned closer and said 6 quiet words, his face turned pale. Evan leaned in close enough for only Ryder to hear. His voice was steady and not angry, not loud, just cold and real. "Clean the mess you made now." Ryder blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Evan pointed at the spilled coffee on the table, then at Grace's stained apron. "You disrespected her. You fix it." The diner stayed silent. Everyone watched as the rich boy's face shifted, from arrogance to shock, then to anger. "You can't tell me what to do," Ryder hissed. Evan didn't even flinch. "You already did enough talking," he said, stepping back and folding his arms. The other bikers stood too, forming a quiet wall behind him. Ryder's friends lowered their heads, suddenly finding their phones very interesting. Grace whispered, "Please let it go," but Evan just gave her a small smile. "Sometimes, ma'am, lessons have to be learned." Ryder finally looked around. Every single eye in the diner was on him. His hands started to shake as he reached for a napkin. Ryder bent down slowly, his pride cracking louder than the diner floor beneath him. He grabbed a rag, his hands trembling. The sound of him wiping the spilled coffee echoed in the silent room. Each stroke of that rag wasn't just cleaning, it was breaking down the arrogance he'd built his whole life on. His friends stared, unsure whether to record or look away. Even the jukebox seemed frozen mid-song. Grace stood there, unsure whether to stop him or let him finish. Her voice trembled. "It's okay, son. You don't have to." But Evan shook his head gently. "No, ma'am," he said. "It's time he learns what respect really means." Ryder looked up at her, guilt swimming in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't a spoiled boy. He was just a young man realizing how wrong he'd been. He whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "I'm sorry." Grace smiled faintly, her tired eyes softening. "Thank you, dear," she said. The tension eased. But this story wasn't done teaching him yet. Something else was still waiting outside that diner. That night, long after the diner had closed, Grace stayed behind wiping tables, the same way she had for years. The chairs were stacked, lights dimmed, and the world outside was quiet again. Then the soft sound of footsteps broke the silence. The door creaked open and Ryder Hail stepped in. No friends, no laughter, just guilt written all over his young face. He held an envelope in his shaking hands. I wanted to make things right," he said softly. Inside was a stack of cash, his father's money. Grace looked at it, then at him. "Money can't clean what pride dirties," she said gently. "But kindness can." Her words hit deeper than any punishment could. Ryder nodded slowly, eyes wet. He left the envelope on the counter and turned to go. Outside, under the neon diner sign, Evan stood by his bike, smoking quietly. He watched Ryder walk away and muttered under his breath, "Maybe there's hope for him after all." A week later, something unexpected showed up in Grace's locker. A message that would change everything. A week later, Grace opened her small locker at the back of the diner and froze. Taped inside was a folded piece of paper with her name written on it. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were just a few simple words. "Thank you for forgiving me. I'm volunteering at the community kitchen now. You showed me what real work looks like." A tear rolled down Grace's cheek as she read it again and again. Beside the note was a printed receipt, an anonymous donation made to a local shelter under her name. She covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh, dear Lord." That boy who once spat on her uniform had turned his guilt into kindness. When Evan came in later that morning, Grace showed him the note. He smiled softly and said, "Looks like your kindness hit harder than my fists ever could." Grace chuckled through tears. "Maybe the world still has a little good left, Evan." The camera lingers on the note in her hand, proof that even one act of forgiveness can change a heart forever. The next morning, Grace served coffee as she always did, calm, warm, and smiling. But something inside her had changed. Every time she looked at that empty booth where Ryder once sat, she didn't feel pain anymore, and she felt peace. Word of what happened spread quietly around town. Some said it was the bikers who taught the boy a lesson. Others said it was Grace's forgiveness that changed him. But those who were there knew the truth. It took both courage and kindness to make that moment happen. Later that evening, Evan returned to the diner. He left a small red rose by Grace's register with a note that read, "For the woman who reminded us that respect still matters." Grace smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. She tucked the rose in her apron and whispered, "Thank you." Because sometimes, it's not strength or revenge that changes people, it's compassion. And that's what makes stories like this worth remembering. If this story touched your heart, don't scroll away. Like, share, and subscribe to Black and Wrong to keep stories of kindness and redemption alive. And before you go, tell us in the comments, would you have stood up like Evan or forgiven like Grace?